The air in the courtroom was as cold and unforgiving as the marble that lined its walls, each word from Richard's lawyer echoing with calculated cruelty. Clara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a portrait of serene composure that was utterly at odds with the public dismantling of her life. The lawyer's voice, a smooth and venomous baritone, painted her as a conniving gold digger, an unsophisticated woman from a poor background who had trapped a man of immense wealth and was now trying to bleed him dry. Across the room, her husband Richard sat beside his new woman, Veronica, both of them radiating an aura of untouchable power. They looked at Clara not as a wife or the mother of their children, but as a final, inconvenient loose end to be tidied up. They thought her silence was a sign of defeat, her stillness a prelude to surrender. But they were wrong. They failed to notice the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw or the quiet resolve in her eyes. And they certainly had no idea about the simple manila envelope resting on the judge's bench, a document that held a truth more explosive than any fortune, ready to detonate their perfectly constructed world. Richard's lawyer gestured toward Clara with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his voice dripping with condescension as he addressed the judge. "Your Honor, we are talking about a woman who lacks the refinement and cultural exposure necessary to raise the heirs to the sterling fortune. Can we, in good conscience, allow these boys to be shaped by a mother whose greatest ambition was simply to marry well? She is asking for a settlement that would bankrupt a small nation, all while feigning victimhood." The words were designed to sting, to humiliate, and they hit their mark, in the gallery, where whispers and stifled snickers rippled through the rows of Richard's wealthy friends and family. Veronica, seated in the front row, allowed a small, triumphant smirk to grace her perfectly painted lips. She leaned over and whispered something to Richard, who nodded, his expression one of pure contempt. He looked at Clara, the woman who had managed his home, raised his sons, and supported his career for a decade, and saw nothing more than an obstacle. He was so blinded by his arrogance that he couldn't see the trap he was walking into, a trap that Clara had been quietly setting for months. Clara felt the weight of every scornful gaze, each whispered judgment a tiny needle piercing her composure. They were trying to erase her, to reduce 10 years of her life to a greedy caricature. At stake was not just the mansion she had turned into a home, or the financial security she was legally owed, but the very narrative of her motherhood. They wanted to take her children, arguing that her simple origins made her an unfit parent for boys destined for greatness. It was a cruel, calculated assault on her dignity, designed to break her spirit before the final verdict was even read. But as she sat there, absorbing the venom, a quiet fire ignited within her. This was no longer about a fair divorce. It was about justice. It was for every woman who had ever been underestimated, discarded, or told she wasn't good enough. If you, like so many others, believe that arrogance should have a price and that quiet strength can topple empires, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel and hit the like button because you are about to witness a masterclass in elegant revenge, where the woman everyone wrote off is about to rewrite their future. Richard Sterling felt a surge of satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. His legal team was the best money could buy, and they were systematically dismantling Clara's credibility with surgical precision. He adjusted the knot of his silk tie, the fabric a deep, commanding navy blue that matched his custom-tailored suit. In his mind, this hearing was nothing more than a corporate negotiation. He was divesting from a failed asset, and he intended to do so with minimal losses. He had always been ashamed of Clara's background, a fact he'd hidden from his social circle with carefully curated stories and limited public appearances. Now he was finally upgrading to a model more suitable for his station. Veronica, a woman born into wealth, who understood the intricate dance of high society. He glanced at Clara, seeing only weakness. He remembered her tears the night he'd served her the papers, her pleas to think of their family. He'd mistaken her pain for fragility, her love for dependence. That mistake, that monumental underestimation of the woman he had once promised to cherish, was about to cost him everything he held dear. Veronica watched the proceedings with the focused intensity of a predator cornering its prey. Every word from the lawyer was a victory, every flicker of pain on Clara's face a confirmation of her upcoming triumph. She wore a dress the color of blood diamonds, a bold statement in the somber courtroom, and on her finger flashed the engagement ring Richard had given her, a stone so large it was almost vulgar. For years she had orbited Richard's life, patiently waiting for the moment she could usurp Clara's position. She had planted seeds of doubt in his mind, whispering poison about Clara's simplicity, her lack of ambition, her unsuitability as the matriarch of the Sterling dynasty. Veronica wasn't just after Richard's money, she was after the name, the status, the legacy. She wanted to be the one photographed at galas, the one whose name was on the board of charities, the one who would raise the Sterling heirs. Her desperation to secure this future made her ruthless, and she believed her victory was just moments away. She failed to notice the judge's gaze linger on her for a moment too long, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes as he glanced from her face down to the sealed envelope on his desk. The judge, a man named Arthur Vance, who had presided over family court for 30 years, had seen every shade of human greed and heartbreak. He listened impassively to the arguments, his face a mask of judicial neutrality. But his attention kept returning to the plain manila envelope that had been delivered to his chambers by Clara's lawyer under a seal of confidentiality. It contained a motion and a set of documents that were, to put it mildly, extraordinary. He had read them the night before, his initial disbelief giving way to a cold, professional anger. While Richard's lawyer droned on about Clara's unsuitability, Judge Vance looked at the two women at the center of the storm. He saw Veronica radiating a brittle, anxious confidence, and he saw Clara, whose quiet dignity seemed to grow stronger with every insult hurled her way. He knew that the contents of that envelope would not just settle a divorce case, they would shatter lives and expose a deception so profound it would become the talk of the city for years. The law was about to become an instrument not just of division, but of a devastating and poetic revelation. In the back of the courtroom, seated between Clara's soft-spoken but formidable lawyer and a trusted family friend, were the twin boys, Leo and Noah. At 8 years old, they were too young to comprehend the legal jargon or the undercurrents of hatred in the room, but they could feel the tension. They had been told this was a place where adults made important decisions about their family. Leo, the more sensitive of the two, clutched a small toy car, while Noah watched the proceedings with a solemn curiosity. Clara allowed herself a brief fleeting glance over her shoulder, her eyes meeting theirs for just a second. In that single look, she conveyed a world of love, reassurance, and a silent promise. I will protect you. This fight was for them. It was for their future, their peace, and their right to grow up surrounded by truth, not by the suffocating lies and toxic ambition of their father's world. The sight of their innocent faces steeled her resolve. Let Richard and Veronica have their moment of smug superiority. The truth had a longer memory, and it was patiently waiting in a sealed envelope to speak on behalf of her children. As Richard's lawyer concluded his character assassination with a flourish, a heavy silence descended upon the courtroom. The stage was set. Everyone present, the family, the press, the legal teams, expected the judge to begin the process of ruling in Richard's favor, granting him a swift and advantageous divorce that would leave Clara with little more than her wounded pride. Richard leaned back in his chair, the picture of a man who had already won. Veronica placed a possessive hand on his arm, her smile sharp and final. They believed they were at the end of the story, the triumphant victors in a battle of wills. But they were only at the end of a chapter, the one they had written themselves. The judge picked up the manila envelope, his movements deliberate and slow. He cleared his throat, and the sound cut through the silence like a blade. "Before we proceed," he began, his voice calm but firm, "there is the matter of a sealed motion filed by Mrs. Sterling that must be addressed." In that moment, the entire balance of power in the room began to shift, tilting away from the millionaire and his mistress and toward the poor wife they had so foolishly underestimated. To understand the chilling silence Clara maintained in that courtroom, one must rewind the clock 10 years to a time when her world was filled not with the cold echo of legal threats, but with the warmth of what she believed was true love. She met Richard Sterling at a small-town art gallery where she worked, a place he'd wandered into by chance during a weekend escape from the city. He was captivated by her quiet intelligence and the genuine passion she had for her work, a stark contrast to the calculated transactional relationships he was used to. For Clara, Richard was not a millionaire. He was a man with a surprisingly gentle smile and a loneliness in his eyes that she felt an irresistible urge to soothe. She fell in love with the man, not the fortune. When he asked her to marry her and move to his world of glittering skyscrapers and sprawling estates, she said yes without hesitation, believing their love was strong enough to bridge the gap between their two vastly different worlds. She left everything she knew behind for him, armed with nothing but a hopeful heart and a profound, naive trust. In the beginning, her love was the invisible engine that ran the Sterling household. Richard's mansion, previously a cold and sterile showcase of wealth, slowly transformed under her touch. She filled its cavernous rooms with life, with the scent of fresh flowers from the garden she personally tended, and with the laughter of their future children. She managed the staff with kindness rather than authority, planned every social event with meticulous care, and created a sanctuary of perfect order and tranquility that Richard could return to after his brutal corporate battles. He never had to worry about a single domestic detail, freeing him to focus entirely on doubling and then tripling the family fortune. He would often praise her for creating a perfect home, yet he never seemed to grasp that she was not just a manager, but a partner, the silent co-architect of the very stability that allowed his ambition to flourish. Her contributions were immeasurable, but in his world they were also invisible, carrying no weight on a balance sheet and, therefore, in his mind, holding no real value. The birth of their twin sons, Leo and Noah, should have been the moment that solidified their family, the ultimate testament to their union. For Clara, it was. She poured every ounce of her being into motherhood, her love for the boys fierce and absolute. However, the arrival of heirs also brought the Sterling clan and their quiet judgments more frequently into her home. Richard's mother, a woman who measured worth in bloodlines and stock portfolios, made a passing comment in the hospital that always stuck with Clara. "It's remarkable," she'd said, peering into the bassinets, "how Leo is the spitting image of a Sterling. Well, Noah, he must take after your side of the family." At the time, Clara dismissed it as the casual cruelty of a snobbish matriarch. Even Veronica, then just a family friend who visited with unnerving frequency, seemed to focus her affections almost exclusively on Leo, cooing over how he had Richard's eyes while barely glancing at his brother. These were just tiny dissonant notes in the symphony of new motherhood, easily ignored but never entirely forgotten. As the years passed and Richard's empire expanded, a subtle but corrosive change began to settle over him. The man who had once been charmed by her simplicity now seemed embarrassed by it. His gentle corrections turned into public humiliations. At lavish dinner parties, he would interrupt her stories with a condescending chuckle, saying, "Darling, let's not bore our guests with tales from your former life." He began curating her existence, choosing her clothes, her friends, and even her words, trying to mold her into an acceptable accessory for a man of his stature. The more successful he became, the more Clara felt like a relic from a past he was eager to erase. The love and admiration in his eyes were replaced by a cold, appraising stare, as if he were constantly evaluating her and finding her wanting. He was no longer the man she had fallen in love with. He had become a prisoner of his own success, and in his eyes, she was the last chain connecting him to a past he now deemed beneath him. It was into this growing chasm between them that Veronica slithered, positioning herself as the perfect antidote to Richard's dissatisfaction. She was everything Clara wasn't, born into wealth, fluent in the cynical language of high society, and ruthless in her ambition. She began as Richard's confidant, listening to his complaints about Clara's lack of sophistication and offering sympathetic sighs. "Richard, you deserve a partner who can stand with you on the world stage," she would murmur over expensive lunches, her words a slow-acting poison. She masterfully painted Clara as a provincial burden, a sweet but simple woman, incapable of navigating the complexities of their world. Veronica never raised her voice or made an overt attack. Her methods were far more insidious. She chipped away at Clara's marriage with carefully placed doubts and whispered criticisms, all while presenting herself as the only one who truly understood the pressures a man like Richard faced. She wasn't just seducing a married man, she was executing a calculated corporate takeover of his life. Clara's isolation was compounded by the Sterling family, who had always viewed her as a temporary curiosity. They treated her with a veneer of politeness that was colder than any outright hostility. Holiday dinners were exercises in quiet torture, where the conversation revolved around European ski trips, art auctions, and business acquisitions she knew nothing about. Her attempts to contribute were met with blank stares or polite, dismissive smiles before the topic was swiftly changed. She was the outsider at their table, a silent observer in her own family. Richard, far from defending her, seemed to encourage this dynamic, using her exclusion as further proof of her inability to fit in. He left her to fend for herself in a sea of passive-aggressive sharks, never realizing that the woman he was allowing to be isolated was also learning to survive, to watch, and to understand the predators around her with a clarity that only a silent observer can possess. Her loneliness became her training ground, sharpening her instincts and steeling her resolve in ways he could never imagine. Soon, the affair was no longer a secret. Richard stopped offering flimsy excuses for his late nights and weekend absences with Veronica. He flaunted their relationship, appearing with her at restaurants and social events where he knew they would be seen. When Clara finally confronted him, her heart shattering with each word, he didn't even have the decency to lie. Instead, he turned her pain back on her, his voice dripping with disdain.
"What did you expect, Clara? Did you really think you could keep a man like me satisfied?" Veronica challenges me. "She understands my world. You just manage the house." The cruelty was breathtaking. He framed his betrayal as a logical consequence of her inadequacy, making her feel as though his infidelity was her own fault. He had successfully reframed their entire marriage in his mind. He wasn't a cheater. He was a man who had simply outgrown his wife. It was a narrative that absolved him of all guilt and cemented Clara's role as the disposable first draft of his life story. The final public degradation before the divorce came during the annual Sterling Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of the city's social calendar. Richard had insisted Clara attend, claiming it was crucial to maintain appearances. But from the moment they arrived, he abandoned her. He paraded Veronica around the grand ballroom, her crimson dress a slash of defiance against the elegant decor. He introduced her to his most powerful associates, his hand possessively on the small of her back, while Clara stood alone by a marble pillar, holding a glass of champagne she never drank. She watched the entire spectacle, a queen in exile in her own kingdom, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with cruel amusement. That night, she understood that her marriage wasn't just over, it was being publicly dismantled, piece by painful piece. Richard wasn't just leaving her, he was erasing her, and he wanted the entire world to watch him do it. The spark that ignited her silent rebellion came not from his infidelity, but from a mother's fear. One of the twins, Noah, developed a rare blood condition that required a series of complex genetic screenings. It was during a private consultation, the specialist, a kind but direct woman, pointed to a line on a report with a puzzled expression. "This is highly unusual, Mrs. Sterling," she explained gently. "Based on this specific genetic marker, it is medically impossible for you and your husband to be Noah's biological parents." The words hung in the sterile air, nonsensical and terrifying. Clara's mind reeled in confusion, but then, like a series of lightning flashes in a dark room, fragmented memories began to connect. Her mother-in-law's comment at the hospital, Veronica's strange, almost obsessive focus on Leo, a vague recollection of a chaotic moment in the nursery ward, a supposed mix-up with the bassinets that the nurses had quickly dismissed. A cold, horrifying suspicion began to form in her mind, a truth so monstrous it felt impossible, yet it explained everything. The divorce papers arrived a week later, delivered by a cold-faced courier during Sunday dinner. Richard didn't even have the courage to hand them to her himself. That evening, he made his formal announcement to his family, with Veronica sitting by his side. "Clara and I are ending our marriage," he declared, his tone final. "It's time this family had a matriarch of the proper caliber." He then informed Clara that his lawyers would offer her a generous but non-negotiable settlement, and if she fought it, he would use every resource at his disposal to prove she was an unstable and unfit mother, ensuring she would lose her sons. It was in that moment, facing the full force of his cruelty and arrogance, that Clara's heartbreak finally hardened into something unbreakable. He thought he was threatening her with the loss of her children, but he had no idea she was already fighting for a child he didn't even know was his. She looked at the man she once loved, the woman who had stolen her life, and made a silent vow. They wanted a war, she would give them one. But it would be fought on her terms, in a battlefield of her own choosing, with a weapon they would never see coming. The first blow landed not with a shout, but with the quiet, rustling sound of legal papers on a polished mahogany desk. Richard informed Clara that he was transferring ownership of their home, the sprawling estate she had spent a decade turning from a house into a sanctuary, to Veronica. He delivered the news with the detached air of an executive discussing a corporate asset, explaining it was a necessary step to simplify the estate before their divorce was finalized. He didn't seem to notice the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, a beautiful, chaotic ballet that Clara had always loved about that room. He didn't see the faint scratches on the windowsill where their son Noah had once run a toy car. To him, it was just property, a line item on a ledger. For Clara, it was the theft of her history, the erasure of her life's work. He was giving the keys to her kingdom to the usurper, and he did it with a casual cruelty that suggested she had never been more than a temporary caretaker, a placeholder until the real queen arrived. She said nothing, her silence a placid lake over a churning volcanic core. A week later, the Sterling clan gathered in the formal dining room for what Richard's mother called a family transition meeting. It was, in reality, a public coronation for Veronica and a final dismissal for Clara. They discussed the upcoming division of assets as if she wasn't even there, her presence reduced to that of a specter at the feast. When Clara tried to gently interject with a memory about the twins' first holiday in that very room, Richard's older sister let out a patronizing laugh.
"Oh, Clara, always so sentimental," she remarked, her voice dripping with condescension. "We're discussing financial instruments, not nursery rhymes." The table erupted in polite, cruel chuckles. Veronica, seated at the head of the table in Clara's former chair, simply smiled, a silent, triumphant endorsement of the humiliation. In that moment, Clara understood she was not just being divorced from a man, she was being expelled from a tribe, a clan that had only ever tolerated her as a necessary vessel for their heirs, and was now discarding her like a used, disposable wrapper. The public humiliations grew more brazen. Clara ran into Veronica at a charity luncheon, a carefully orchestrated encounter. Veronica, draped in designer clothes and flashing her enormous new engagement ring, made a great show of sympathizing with Clara's situation. She took Clara's hand, her manicured fingers brushing against the simple gold band Richard had placed there 10 years ago. "Oh, that's a lovely little thing," Veronica cooed, her voice loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "It has a certain vintage charm. Richard's taste has become so much more refined over the years, hasn't it?" She then held up her own hand, letting the massive diamond on her finger catch the light, a blinding, arrogant star. The implication was clear. Clara was the past, the modest first draft, while Veronica was the brilliant, expensive final edition. Clara simply withdrew her hand, her face a mask of serene neutrality. But inside, she felt the sting of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one a reminder of how completely she was being replaced and devalued. Her role as a mother was the next thing they tried to dismantle. Richard began treating her less like a co-parent and more like an inconveniently scheduled nanny. One Friday evening, he breezed into the house, tossing a set of car keys onto the marble countertop. "I need you to handle the boys tonight," he announced, not looking at her. "Veronica and I have a reservation at the Crestwood. I've left some cash for pizza." The act of leaving cash was a calculated insult, reducing her maternal care to a transaction, a service to be paid for. Leo, their observant son, looked up from his coloring book and asked with heartbreaking innocence, "Why can't you come with us, Mommy? Why is Daddy always going out with Aunt Veronica?" Clara knelt down, her heart aching, and smoothed his hair. "Grown-ups have boring things to do sometimes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice steady despite the tremor in her soul. She was being forced to lie to her own children to cover for the man who was systematically erasing her from their lives. Even the small corner of the world she had carved for herself was taken away. For years, Clara had served on the board of a local children's hospital foundation, a role she took seriously and poured her heart into. It was her only public identity outside of being Mrs. Sterling. One afternoon, she received a call from the board chairwoman, a woman who played tennis with Veronica every Tuesday. The conversation was brief and brutal, cloaked in the soft language of corporate restructuring. "Clara, dear," the woman began, her voice syrupy sweet, "with the foundation moving in a new, more high-profile direction, we've decided to refresh our board. We need faces that align with our new global fundraising strategy." It was a polite but firm dismissal. They were replacing her with Veronica, whose family name carried more weight with international donors. They were not just taking her husband and her home, they were methodically stripping her of her name, her purpose, and her dignity, one piece at a time, ensuring she would be left with absolutely nothing. The final tether to her old life was severed in the most public and debasing way possible. Richard, through his lawyers, froze her access to their joint bank accounts without warning. She discovered this while standing in line at the city's most exclusive organic market, her cart filled with the boys' favorite snacks. The card was declined. Then it was declined again. The cashier, a young woman with kind eyes, looked at her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. The people in line behind her began to shift impatiently, their whispers like the hiss of snakes. Humiliation washed over Clara in a hot, suffocating wave. She had to abandon the full cart and walk out of the store, her face burning with shame. When she called Richard, his voice was cold and clipped. "All household expenses must now be submitted to my assistant for approval," he stated flatly. "I can't have you making frivolous purchases during this sensitive time." He had reduced the mother of his children to a supplicant, forced to beg for every dollar from the very man who was destroying her. The breaking point came at Noah's 8th birthday party, held in the gardens of the home that was no longer hers. Richard had insisted on hosting it for the boys' sake, but it was a thinly veiled celebration of his new life. Veronica played the role of hostess with practiced ease, greeting guests and directing staff, while Clara stood by the French doors, an invisible ghost at her own son's celebration. The Sterling family and their friends swarmed around Veronica, praising her for the wonderful changes she had made to the decor, the menu, the very atmosphere of the home. No one spoke to Clara. No one even made eye contact.
She watched as Veronica knelt down to help Noah blow out his candles, positioning herself perfectly for the photographer Richard had hired. The resulting picture would show a perfect family, a powerful father, a beautiful new mother, and 2 happy sons. Clara was not just outside the frame, she had been completely cut out of the picture of her own life. Later that night, after the last guest had departed and the hollow laughter had finally faded, Clara retreated to her bedroom, now a guest room in her own house. The sight of her packed suitcases lining the wall was the final confirmation of her complete and utter displacement. She sank onto the edge of the bed, the carefully constructed dam of her composure finally breaking. A wave of profound, soul-crushing despair washed over her. She was nothing. 10 years of love, sacrifice, and devotion had been wiped away as if they had never existed. They had taken her home, her name, her friends, her financial independence, and even her role in her children's lives. She felt the crushing weight of their victory and her own powerlessness. For a fleeting, terrifying moment, she wanted to disappear, to simply cease to exist. Because the pain of being so thoroughly and cruelly discarded felt like a wound from which she could never recover. This was the bottom, a cold, dark place where hope went to die. But in that abyss of desolation, as she stared at her reflection in the darkened window, something shifted. It wasn't a sudden explosion of rage, but the emergence of a cold, diamond-hard resolve from the ashes of her heartbreak. Her eyes fell upon a framed photo on her nightstand. Leo and Noah, their arms around each other, grinning at the camera. She thought of Noah's medical file, of the doctor's confused words, of the impossible truth locked away in her heart. They thought this fight was about a house, about money, about social status. They were so blinded by their own arrogance they couldn't see the real battlefield. They had tried to humiliate the poor wife, the simple mother, but they had underestimated the ferocious, primal power of a mother protecting her child from a lie that monstrous. Her pain, once a crippling weight, now began to transform, forging itself into a weapon of surgical precision. They had left her with nothing, which meant she now had nothing left to lose. Clara stood up, walked to the bathroom, and splashed cold water on her face. When she looked in the mirror again, the defeated woman was gone. In her place was a strategist, a silent warrior preparing for a battle they didn't even know was coming. From that moment on, her submission became her camouflage. She would play the part of the broken, compliant victim they all expected her to be. She would agree to their insulting terms, sign their preliminary papers, and allow them to savor their victory. Her silence would lull them into a state of supreme confidence, making them feel untouchable. But beneath the placid surface of her surrender, a meticulous plan was already in motion. She would let them walk confidently into that courtroom, into the trap she and her lawyer had so carefully prepared. They thought they were presiding over her destruction, when in fact they were marching toward their own, led by their own hubris and the quiet, underestimated woman who held the one secret that could bring their entire fraudulent empire crashing down. The initial shockwave of the doctor's words left Clara breathless, adrift in a silent, sterile examination room that suddenly felt like a void. Medically impossible, the specialist had repeated, her voice gentle but firm, pointing to the complex genetic markers on Noah's chart. The phrase echoed in her mind, a scientific absolute that defied a decade of lived reality. For a moment her world tilted on its axis, a dizzying sense of unreality washing over her. But as the initial confusion subsided, a chilling clarity began to emerge. Fragmented memories, once dismissed as insignificant slights, now clicked into place with horrifying precision. Her mother-in-law's cutting remark in the hospital about Noah not looking like a Sterling. Veronica's almost obsessive doting on Leo while barely acknowledging his twin. The strange, frantic energy of the nurses on the day they were discharged, a brief bassinet mix-up that was quickly smoothed over. Each memory was a breadcrumb, leading her down a path she never wanted to travel. A path that pointed toward a truth so monstrous, so unthinkable, that her very soul recoiled from it. She was no longer just a wife fighting a divorce. She was a mother standing on the precipice of a terrifying discovery. Driven by a cold, primal fear, Clara began her own secret investigation, transforming her grief into a meticulous, focused quest for the truth. During the day, she played the part of the defeated wife, but at night, after the boys were asleep and the house was silent, she descended into a digital rabbit hole of the past. She scoured old social media posts, online birth announcements from the local papers, and hospital newsletters from 8 years ago. She was searching for a ghost, a connection that could explain the impossible. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and determination. And then she found it. Tucked away in the archives of a high society blog was a small, almost perfunctory announcement. Veronica DeWitt had given birth to a son, Alexander, just 1 day after Leo and Noah were born, in the very same maternity ward at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital. The coincidence was too stark, too precise to be random. A wave of ice-cold certainty washed over Clara. This was it. This was the missing piece of the puzzle, the dark secret that explained everything. Veronica hadn't just stolen her husband. She had orchestrated something far more sinister, a long con of unimaginable cruelty. Knowing she was entering a war against a man with limitless resources and a woman with no morals, Clara understood she couldn't fight alone. She needed an ally, a guide who understood the treacherous intersection of law, wealth, and human depravity. She bypassed the city's high-powered corporate law firms, the kind Richard would have on retainer, and instead sought out Samuel Pierce, a semi-retired family law attorney with a reputation for quiet integrity and taking on cases that others deemed too complicated or too sensitive. His office was not a monument to ego, but a sanctuary of knowledge, lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with worn legal texts. As she sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, she laid out the entire story. Noah's medical report, the discovery of Veronica's son, the litany of strange coincidences. Samuel listened intently, his gaze sharp and unwavering, his expression growing grimmer with each revelation. He didn't interrupt, didn't question her sanity. He simply absorbed the facts, recognizing the profound evil she was describing. When she finished, he leaned forward, his voice low but resolute. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, "what you are suggesting is a crime of profound moral turpitude. If you are right, we will not just be fighting a divorce, we will be unearthing a conspiracy." Samuel immediately understood that Clara's suspicions, however compelling, were not enough. They needed irrefutable proof, something that could withstand the inevitable assault from Richard's legal team. He activated his most trusted resource, a discreet private investigator named Elias Vance, a man who moved through the world like a shadow. Elias began by digging into the hospital's records from that fateful week 8 years ago. He discovered a pattern of unusual security log entries and a surprising number of staff transfers in the months that followed. His breakthrough came when he cross-referenced financial records and found a former maternity ward nurse, a woman named Helen, who had quit her job suddenly and paid off a massive mortgage with cash just weeks after the twins' birth. The money trail was a smoking gun, a clear indicator of a payoff. Elias tracked Helen down to a quiet suburban town hundreds of miles away, where she was living a modest life under a different name. The discovery electrified their case. They now had a direct link, a human element to the conspiracy. They had found the person who had been paid to facilitate the unthinkable, and her testimony would be the key to unlocking the entire deception. The meeting with the former nurse was one of the most difficult moments of Clara's life. They met in a sterile, anonymous hotel room midway between their cities. Helen, now a woman in her late 50s, was visibly terrified, her hands trembling as she clutched a cup of tea. She initially denied everything, her voice a strained whisper, insisting it was all a misunderstanding. Samuel presented the financial records, the evidence of the cash payment, but she remained steadfast in her denial. It was then that Clara, seeing the woman's fear warring with a deep-buried guilt, decided to appeal not to her conscience, but to her humanity. She pulled out her phone and showed Helen a recent photo of Noah, his face bright with an innocent gap-toothed smile. "This," Clara said softly, her voice devoid of accusation, filled only with a mother's pain. At the sight of the boy's face, Helen's composure finally shattered. Sobs racked her body as she confessed the entire story. Veronica, cold and calculating, had approached her weeks before the birth, offering her a life-changing sum of money to switch her sickly newborn with one of Clara's healthy twins, securing her own son a place in the Sterling dynasty. Back in Samuel's quiet, book-lined office, the strategy for justice was forged. A public accusation, even with the nurse's confession, would devolve into a chaotic media circus. Richard's army of lawyers would paint Helen as an unreliable, greedy extortionist, and Clara as a hysterical, vengeful ex-wife. They would bury the truth under an avalanche of motions and character assassinations. Samuel proposed a far more elegant and devastating approach, a Trojan horse. They would file a sealed motion directly with the presiding judge, presenting the nurse's sworn affidavit and the initial medical report as preliminary evidence. Citing concerns over the emotional stability of the family unit, they would formally request a court-ordered paternity test for both twin boys, framing it as a standard procedure to finalize custody and inheritance rights. The results would be sent directly to the judge, remaining under seal until the hearing.
Richard and Veronica would walk into the courtroom believing they were about to witness Clara's final humiliation, completely oblivious to the fact that the judge would be holding a time bomb, ticking down to the moment it would obliterate their world of lies. Clara embraced her new role with the cold focus of a master strategist. Her performance had to be flawless. She became the very picture of the woman they believed her to be. Broken, compliant, and utterly defeated. She allowed Richard's lawyers to bully her during depositions. She accepted their insulting preliminary settlement offers with a quiet sigh of resignation, and she endured Veronica's triumphant glares at social events with a downcast gaze. Her submission was her greatest weapon, lulling her adversaries into a state of supreme arrogant confidence. Every condescending word from Richard, every patronizing smile from his family, was no longer a wound, but fuel for the fire of her resolve. They mistook her silence for weakness, her compliance for surrender. They had no idea that beneath that placid surface she was a warrior sharpening her blade, counting down the days until the battle. She was no longer fighting for a share of his fortune. She was fighting for the truth, for her son's identity, and for the profound poetic justice of watching a world built on lies crumble under the weight of a single, undeniable fact. The final pieces of the trap clicked into place with an almost beautiful precision. As expected, Richard received the court order for the paternity test with dismissive annoyance. He called Clara, his voice dripping with contempt. "Another desperate, pathetic move, Clara. What do you hope to gain from this? Do you think a judge will give you more money because of a DNA test? My lawyers say it's a standard procedure, so I've agreed. Let's just get this over with." He was so blinded by his own narrative that this was all about money, he couldn't see the real danger. He and Veronica were so focused on securing Leo, the true sterling heir, that the possibility of any issue with Noah never even registered. They arranged for the samples to be taken, treating the entire affair as a minor inconvenience on their path to victory. Clara watched them, her face a perfect mask of sorrowful defeat, while inside her heart beat with the steady, powerful rhythm of impending justice. The samples were sent, the results were processed, and a simple manila envelope was dispatched to Judge Vance's chambers, containing a truth more valuable than the entire sterling fortune and more explosive than dynamite. While Richard was busy dismantling the past, he was also aggressively building his future with Veronica, a future predicated on the complete erasure of Clara. In the sterile, glass-walled office of his corporate attorney, he signed the final documents transferring the title of the sterling estate. The pen, a weighty gold instrument, moved with a decisive, almost violent finality across the page. He felt no remorse, only a sense of profound relief, as if shedding a heavy, outdated coat. "This simplifies everything," he remarked to his lawyer, who nodded obsequiously. "Once the divorce is finalized, Veronica and I can begin our lives without any lingering complications." He pictured Veronica in the grand foyer, her portrait replacing Clara's above the marble fireplace. He was not just changing wives, he was curating a legacy, and in his version of history, Clara was a footnote, a minor character who had served her purpose and was now being written out of the story. His confidence was absolute, a fortress built on a foundation of wealth and arrogance, impenetrable to any threat he could possibly imagine. In stark contrast to the cold finality of Richard's legal maneuvers, Clara's preparations took place in the quiet, book-lined sanctuary of Samuel Pierce's office. There was no triumphant fanfare, only the low hum of focused determination. She and Samuel spent hours reviewing the sworn affidavit from Helen, the former nurse.
Every word of the confession had been transcribed, notarized, and cross-referenced with hospital records that Elias, the investigator, had painstakingly unearthed. They mapped out the legal strategy not as an attack, but as a simple, undeniable presentation of fact. The power of this, Samuel explained, his finger tapping the sealed document, is in its simplicity. We are not making accusations. We are merely asking a question that the evidence compels us to ask. The court will order the test, and the truth will do the rest. Clara felt a calm settle over her, a strange sense of peace in the eye of the storm. She was not a vengeful wife seeking retribution. She was a mother armed with an irrefutable truth, and she was about to use it to protect the sanctity of her family from the lies that had nearly torn it apart. Veronica, meanwhile, had already begun her reign as the new lady of the Sterling Manor. She moved through the house with the proprietary air of a conqueror, directing a team of decorators to strip away every last vestige of Clara's existence. The soft, neutral tones Clara had favored were being replaced with bold, dramatic colors. Family photos featuring Clara were discreetly removed from silver frames and replaced with professionally shot portraits of Veronica and Richard. He was not just changing wives, he was curating a legacy, and in his version of history, Clara was a footnote, a minor character who had served her purpose and was now being written out of the story. His confidence was absolute, a fortress built on a foundation of wealth and arrogance, impenetrable to any threat he could possibly imagine. In stark contrast to the cold finality of Richard's legal maneuvers, Clara's preparations took place in the quiet, book-lined sanctuary of Samuel Pierce's office. There was no triumphant fanfare, only the low hum of focused determination. She and Samuel spent hours reviewing the sworn affidavit from Helen, the former nurse. Every word of the confession had been transcribed, notarized, and cross-referenced with hospital records that Elias, the investigator, had painstakingly unearthed. They mapped out the legal strategy not as an attack, but as a simple, undeniable presentation of fact. The power of this, Samuel explained, his finger tapping the sealed document, is in its simplicity. We are not making accusations. We are merely asking a question that the evidence compels us to ask. The court will order the test, and the truth will do the rest. Clara felt a calm settle over her, a strange sense of peace in the eye of the storm. She was not a vengeful wife seeking retribution. She was a mother armed with an irrefutable truth, and she was about to use it to protect the sanctity of her family from the lies that had nearly torn it apart. Veronica, meanwhile, had already begun her reign as the new lady of the Sterling Manor. She moved through the house with the proprietary air of a conqueror, directing a team of decorators to strip away every last vestige of Clara's existence. The soft, neutral tones Clara had favored were being replaced with bold, dramatic colors. Family photos featuring Clara were discreetly removed from silver frames and replaced with professionally shot portraits of Veronica and Richard.
She even ordered the replanting of the rose garden Clara had so lovingly tended, deeming the flowers common. Her every action was a declaration of victory, a public performance of her new status. When Richard mentioned the court-ordered paternity test, she waved a dismissive hand, a flicker of annoyance crossing her features. "It's just another one of her pathetic, low-class attempts to cause trouble," she sneered. "Let her have her little test. It changes nothing." Her desperation to secure her position made her blind, unable to see that the one thing she thought was her greatest secret was about to become her most public downfall. While Veronica was busy erasing her past, Clara was quietly building her future. In the evenings, after putting the boys to bed, she would sit at her laptop, not dwelling on revenge, but researching small towns nestled in the countryside.
Places with good schools and open fields where her sons could grow up far from the toxic glare of high society. She wasn't just fighting for a legal victory, she was fighting for a life of peace and authenticity. She looked at listings for charming farmhouses with sprawling backyards, imagining Leo and Noah chasing a dog through the tall grass. This vision was her true north, the anchor that kept her steady through the emotional turmoil. Her fight was not born of hatred for Richard, but of a fierce, all-encompassing love for both of her boys, the one she had given birth to and the one who had been placed in her arms by a cruel twist of fate. She would protect them both, and she would give them a home built on truth, not on the crumbling foundation of the sterling name. A single, crucial warning sign appeared, a fleeting chance for Richard to see the precipice he was approaching, but his arrogance rendered him blind. During a final strategy meeting, his lead attorney, a shrewd man named Marcus Thorne, frowned as he reviewed the case files. "It's odd, Richard," Marcus mused, tapping a pen against his chin. "Clara's legal team has been remarkably passive on the financial front. They've barely contested our settlement offer, which is frankly insulting. Instead, all their energy seems focused on this paternity motion. It feels disproportionate. It's almost as if the money is an afterthought." Richard simply scoffed, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "Of course it is," he replied with a condescending laugh. "It's a classic emotional play. She knows she can't win on the financials, so she's trying to weaponize the children, to paint me as a bad father. It's a desperate, transparent tactic from a woman with no other cards to play." He dismissed the lawyer's professional intuition without a second thought, completely assured that he understood Clara's motives better than anyone. It was a fatal miscalculation. The final piece of the trap was a work of legal art, elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential. In Samuel's office, Clara held the manila envelope that contained everything: a copy of the sealed motion, the nurse's sworn statement, and the initial medical report that had started it all. It felt impossibly light for something that carried the weight of so many lives. "Once this is filed, there is no turning back," Samuel said, his voice grave. "The court will receive the DNA results directly from the lab. No one will see them before the judge." Clara nodded, her hand steady as she signed the final authorization. Her signature was not the shaky scrawl of a victim, but the firm, confident stroke of a woman in full control of her destiny. They were not fighting Richard's power with more power. They were fighting his complex web of lies with a single, simple truth. The plain envelope, devoid of any hint of the bombshell it contained, was the perfect symbol for Clara herself. Underestimated, unassuming on the outside, but holding a core of unbreakable, explosive strength within. On the morning of the hearing, the Sterling mansion buzzed with an air of triumphant anticipation. Richard stood before a full-length mirror, adjusting the knot of a silver tie, a gift from Veronica. She came up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his shoulder. "Today's the day," she whispered, her voice a purr of satisfaction. "By this afternoon, she'll be nothing but a bad memory." They looked at their reflection, a perfect power couple, poised and untouchable. They spoke of their upcoming wedding in Lake Como, of the charity ball Veronica would chair, of Leo's enrollment in a prestigious boarding school next year. They had already moved on, their conversation a blueprint for a future that did not include Clara or any of the inconvenient truths of the past. They were so busy celebrating their victory that they failed to notice the subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in Veronica's hand as she straightened Richard's lapel, a tiny crack in the flawless facade of her confidence, a subconscious fear of a secret she believed was buried forever. Miles away, in a modest, temporary apartment, Clara's preparations were of a different nature. There was no glamour, only a quiet, focused calm. She knelt before her sons, who were dressed in matching navy blue sweaters. She looked into their eyes one by one, and her heart swelled with a love so fierce it eclipsed any feeling of anger or bitterness.
Today, we are going to a place where some grown-ups will make some important decisions, she explained softly, her voice a steady, reassuring presence. No matter what happens, you need to remember that I love you both more than anything in this world, and I will always, always protect you. She hugged them tightly, breathing in the scent of their hair, drawing strength from their innocence. She then stood and looked at herself in the mirror. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress, the same color as their sweaters, a silent statement of unity. She was not a wife coming to be discarded. She was a mother, arriving with her children, ready to claim the truth that belonged to them. The arrival at the courthouse was a study in contrasts, a visual representation of the entire conflict. Richard and Veronica pulled up in a gleaming black Bentley, stepping out into a flurry of camera flashes from the waiting press. They were flanked by a team of stone-faced lawyers, projecting an image of impenetrable power and wealth. They walked up the marble steps without a glance back, confident and commanding. A few minutes later, Clara arrived in Samuel's modest sedan. She stepped out onto the curb, holding each of her son's hands. Her movements were unhurried, her expression serene. She had no entourage, only her quiet, determined lawyer by her side. As she walked toward the massive bronze doors of the courthouse, a few reporters called out her name, but she didn't flinch. She simply squeezed her son's hands, her gaze fixed straight ahead. The battle was no longer about public perception or legal maneuvering. It had all come down to this moment, to this room, and to the simple manila envelope resting on the judge's bench, waiting to detonate a perfectly constructed world. The judge, Arthur Vance, held up the manila envelope, the simple paper object suddenly commanding more attention than all the expensive suits and legal degrees in the room. A hush fell over the gallery as he broke the seal with a deliberate, almost theatrical slowness. Richard Sterling shifted in his seat, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He saw this as nothing more than a final, desperate gambit from Clara, a meaningless delay before his inevitable victory. He shot a look at Veronica, a shared glance of condescending amusement. They were so close to the finish line, so certain of their triumph, that they viewed this moment not with apprehension, but with impatience. They believed the envelope contained some flimsy, emotional plea, perhaps a letter or a photograph, the last pathetic whimper of a woman who had already lost. They were completely unprepared for the fact that this simple envelope was not a white flag of surrender, but a declaration of war, and the judge was about to read its terms aloud to the entire world, forever altering the balance of power they held so dear. Judge Vance adjusted his reading glasses, his expression unreadable as he scanned the first page of the official lab report. The silence in the courtroom was now so absolute it felt like a physical pressure. "This document," he began, his voice calm and measured, "is the result of a court-ordered paternity test for the two minor children, Leo Sterling and Noah Sterling, as requested in the sealed motion, filed on Mrs. Sterling." He paused, looking over his glasses directly at Richard. "The results for the child Leo Sterling are conclusive. The test confirms with a 99.99% probability that you, Mr. Richard Sterling, are his biological father." A wave of relief washed over Richard's face, quickly replaced by a smug, triumphant smile. He squeezed Veronica's hand under the table. This was perfect. The test proved what he already knew and made Clara's motion look foolish and vindictive. His lawyer let out a quiet sigh of relief. The desperate gambit had failed. They had won. The gallery began to murmur, the sound a soft tide of vindication for the Sterling family, who now saw Clara as not just poor, but pathetic. But the judge was not finished. He held up a hand to quell the rising whispers, his gaze once again fixed on the document before him. A cold, professional authority returned to his voice, cutting through the smug atmosphere like a surgeon's scalpel. "However," he continued, the single word instantly silencing the room, "the results for the second child, Noah Sterling, are equally conclusive." He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the weight of the moment build until it was almost unbearable. "The test report definitively excludes Mr. Richard Sterling as the biological father of the child Noah." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. The air was sucked out of the room, replaced by a stunning electric shock. Richard's triumphant smile froze, then crumbled into a mask of utter disbelief. His face turned a blotchy, furious red. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking. "It's a lie. She forged it. This is a trick." All eyes were now on Clara, but she remained perfectly still, her serene expression unchanged, a silent, immovable rock in the center of the raging storm she had just unleashed. Richard staggered to his feet, his composure completely shattered. He pointed a trembling finger at Clara, his face contorted with a mixture of rage and confusion. "This is a farce, a pathetic, desperate attempt to extort money from me," he roared, his voice echoing off the cold marble walls.
She has been planning this, trying to ruin my name because I am leaving her for a better woman. Your Honor, I demand this fraudulent document be thrown out." His lawyer, Marcus Thorne, was pale, his own professional confidence evaporating in the face of his client's public meltdown and a court-certified document he could not dispute. He tried to gently pull Richard back into his seat, whispering urgent, unheard advice. But Richard was beyond reason, his arrogance refusing to accept a reality that contradicted his own narrative. He was so convinced of Clara's weakness and his own invincibility that the only possible explanation in his mind was a conspiracy against him, a final, venomous act from the poor, simple woman he had so foolishly and completely underestimated. He was still fighting the last war, oblivious to the fact that the battlefield had completely changed beneath his feet. Ignoring Richard's outburst with the quiet disdain of a man who had seen it all, Judge Vance continued, his voice dropping to a somber, final tone. "Mr. Sterling, please be seated. This report was certified by the state's most reputable laboratory and delivered directly to this court under seal. Its authenticity is beyond question." He let that statement settle, allowing Richard's accusations to hang in the air and die. Then he turned to the final, devastating line on the page. "The report does not only address paternity," he stated, his eyes now moving from Richard to land squarely on Veronica, who had frozen in her seat, her face a mask of dawning horror. "As per standard procedure in cases of contested parentage, a maternal DNA comparison was also conducted." He paused, letting the entire room lean in, desperate for the final piece of this shocking puzzle. "The test," Clara read, his voice clear and unforgiving, "that the biological mother of the child, Noah, is Miss Veronica DeWitt." A strangled sound, half gasp, half scream, escaped Veronica's lips as the truth, her darkest secret, was laid bare for all to see. The world seemed to tilt and then shatter for Veronica. The judge's words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and the blood from her face. Her carefully constructed facade of aristocratic grace and untouchable confidence disintegrated in an instant, revealing the desperate, terrified schemer beneath. "No," she whispered, the word a raw, guttural plea. "No, it's not true. He's lying." But her denial was weak, drowned out by the rising tide of horrified murmurs from the gallery. Her eyes, wide with panic, darted around the room, finding no sympathy, only a sea of shocked and accusing faces. Her gaze finally landed on Richard, not with love, but with the frantic terror of a co-conspirator whose plot had just spectacularly imploded. She saw not her future husband, but the man whose life she had just ruined, the man she had deceived for 8 long years. The weight of her monstrous lie, a secret she had carried for nearly a decade, came crashing down on her, and she collapsed in her chair, her body racked with violent, uncontrollable sobs, her public humiliation absolute and complete. For Richard, the world went silent. Veronica's confession-like breakdown was the final, undeniable confirmation of a betrayal so profound it was almost incomprehensible. He sank back into his chair, his body suddenly feeling heavy, ancient. The rage was gone, replaced by a hollow, sickening void. It wasn't just about the lie, it was about the sheer scale of his own foolishness. He had been a pawn, a mark, a monumental fool in a long con orchestrated by the woman sitting next to him. Every whispered word of sympathy from Veronica, every criticism of Clara, every decision he had made in the last 8 years was now cast in a new, hideous light. He had dismantled his family, humiliated the mother of his true son, and cast out the only honest person in his life, all for a woman who had played him for a fool from the very beginning. He had traded gold for glittering dust. The empire he thought he controlled was a sham, his legacy built on a lie, and the woman he had discarded as worthless was the only one who had ever known the truth. Amid the chaos of Veronica's breakdown and Richard's cataclysmic shock, Clara remained an island of profound stillness. She reached out and placed a gentle, reassuring hand on each of her son's shoulders. Leo looked confused, while Noah, the boy at the center of the storm, simply looked at his mother with trusting eyes. In that moment, Clara's victory was not in the destruction of her enemies, but in this quiet act of protection. She did not look at Richard with triumph or at Veronica with hatred. Her gaze was fixed on her children. She had fought this war not to win a fortune or to exact revenge, but to reclaim the truth for a boy who deserved to know who he was, and to protect both of her sons from a world of toxic lies. Her serenity was her ultimate statement of power. She had weathered the storm of public humiliation and private heartbreak, and she had emerged not hardened and bitter, but stronger, calmer, and more certain of her purpose than ever before. She was a mother, and she had just saved her family. Judge Vance struck his gavel once, the sharp crack cutting through the remaining din. "Order in this court," he commanded, his authority absolute. He looked at the wreckage of the Sterling family before him. Richard, a broken man staring into nothingness. Veronica, a sobbing, hysterical mess being attended to by a court officer. And Clara, a portrait of quiet dignity, her hands still resting on her 2 sons. The legal battle for divorce was over, rendered almost irrelevant by the moral and criminal implications of what had just been revealed. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had been inverted with the force of an earthquake. The poor wife, the unfit mother, the woman they had tried to erase, now held everything: the moral high ground, the custody of both children, and the power to decide the fate of the 2 people who had so cruelly underestimated her. As her lawyer, Samuel, gave her a small, respectful nod, Clara finally allowed herself a single, deep breath. It was the breath of a woman who was, at long last, completely and utterly free. The immediate aftermath in the courtroom was not a celebration, but a quiet, seismic implosion. As court officers gently but firmly escorted a wailing Veronica from the room, her cries echoing like a ghost in the marble hall, Richard remained frozen in his chair, a statue carved from disbelief and shame. The friends and family who had filled the gallery, who had come to witness Clara's defeat, now averted their eyes. They looked at Richard not with sympathy, but with a cold, unforgiving judgment. He was no longer the powerful patriarch. He was a fool, a man who had allowed his arrogance and lust to make a mockery of the sterling name. Clara, in stark contrast, rose with a silent grace. She gathered her sons, shielding them from the raw spectacle of their father's collapse. She walked past the wreckage of Richard's life without a single triumphant glance, her posture radiating not victory, but a profound and hard-won peace. Her silence was more devastating than any accusation, a final, damning verdict on the man who had tried to erase her. In the end, his world had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, dignified footsteps of the woman he had so foolishly cast aside. The legal and social fallout was swift and merciless. News of the courtroom drama spread through the city's elite circles like a contagion, carried by texts and whispered phone calls before it ever hit the press. Veronica DeWitt was no longer a socialite. She was a pariah, facing potential criminal charges for fraud and kidnapping, her name forever linked to a scandal of unimaginable depravity. For Richard, the consequences were a slow, public bleed. The board of Sterling Industries called an emergency meeting, and he was forced to step down as CEO, his name now a liability to the company he believed he embodied. His family, obsessed with legacy and appearances, turned on him with the ferocity of a wolf pack, blaming him for bringing this public humiliation upon their dynasty. Samuel Pierce, Clara's lawyer, handled the divorce with surgical precision. There were no more negotiations. Clara was awarded a settlement so substantial it secured her and the boys' futures for generations, including full ownership of a portfolio of assets completely untethered from the tainted Sterling name. Richard didn't fight. He had no fight left in him. He had lost his son, his company, his family, and his reputation, all in the space of a single afternoon. The grand Sterling mansion, once the symbol of Richard's power, became his gilded prison. After the hearing, he returned to its silent, cavernous rooms, each one now a monument to his own spectacular foolishness. He saw the ghost of Clara everywhere, in the garden she had tended, in the library she had organized, in the faint scent of lemon polish she had insisted the staff use. The home he had so cruelly taken from her was now a place he could no longer bear to inhabit. Within a week he put it on the market, unable to escape the memories of his own betrayal. He was a king without a kingdom, a man whose wealth could no longer insulate him from the consequences of his character. The ultimate poetic justice was not in the loss of his money, but in the loss of his sanctuary. He had given Veronica the keys to the house, but it was Clara's quiet integrity that had really owned it. By trying to kick her out, he had only managed to exile himself from the very concept of home, left to wander in a wilderness of his own making. Clara's first act as a free woman was one of profound renunciation. As she and Samuel walked away from the courthouse, besieged by a media frenzy that now painted her as a figure of mysterious strength, she made her intentions clear. "I don't want the mansion," she stated, her voice calm and resolute. "I don't want his name, and I don't want a single thing that reminds my sons of that life." Her victory was not about claiming the spoils of war, it was about achieving a lasting peace. She instructed her lawyer to liquidate her share of the assets and place them into a secure, unassuming trust. She wanted a future, not a fortune. That evening, she sat with Leo and Noah in their small temporary apartment and explained that they were going to start a new adventure, somewhere with more trees and fewer tall buildings. Her sons, sensing the lightness in her spirit, cheered. She was finally shedding the heavy, suffocating weight of the Sterling identity and reclaiming the one that mattered most, her own.
She was no longer Richard Sterling's poor wife. She was simply Clara, a mother building a new world for her children on a foundation of truth. 6 months later, the golden light of late afternoon streamed through the windows of a restored farmhouse nestled in the rolling hills of the countryside. Laughter echoed from the sprawling backyard, where Leo and Noah were chasing a newly adopted golden retriever through a field of wildflowers. Clara stood at the kitchen sink, washing vegetables from her own garden, a contented smile on her face. The silence here was different from the oppressive silence of the Sterling mansion. It was a living, breathing peace, filled with the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. She had created a sanctuary, a home where her boys could grow up defined not by a name or a bank account, but by kindness and integrity. Noah, after months of gentle counseling and unwavering love, understood his own story and was a happy, secure child, fiercely loved by his mother and brother. Clara had won custody with ease. Veronica, facing her own legal battles, was deemed an unfit parent. Clara was finally living the life she had always deserved, a life rich in the things money could never buy. One evening, as she sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the clear country sky, Clara thought back to the woman in the portroom. The woman who had been called a gold digger, an unfit mother, a simpleton. She barely recognized her anymore. The pain and humiliation had not broken her. They had forged her into something stronger, something real. Richard Sterling had tried to define her by what she lacked, never realizing that her true worth was in the things he could never comprehend: resilience, dignity, and a mother's unyielding love. He had lost his entire world clinging to a fraudulent legacy, while she had built a new one from scratch, founded on the simple, powerful truth. A cool breeze swept across the porch, and she pulled a warm quilt around her shoulders, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. He had spent a fortune trying to prove she was worthless, only to discover in the end that she was the only one in his life who possessed anything of real value. And now it was all hers.